March 2, 1945, marks the day a single telegraph transformed a standard military operation into a legend of high-stakes defiance between General George S. Patton and General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Allied advance had reached a point of existential crisis where the math of the planners collided with the instinct of the warrior. Patton's Third Army had seized Germany's oldest city despite direct orders to halt, prompting the most sarcastic question in military history. The strategic landscape of early 1945 was defined by a massive, jagged scar of concrete and steel known as the Westwall or the Siegfried Line. This was not a mere trench system, but a multi-layered zone of death stretching nearly 400 miles to guard the German fatherland from the encroaching Allied might. Hitler's engineers from Organization Todt had poured a third of the Reich's total concrete production into this barrier, creating a warren of 20,000 bunkers and pillboxes designed to be the tomb of the Western Allies. Between the Saar and Moselle rivers lay a specific supplementary line known as the Oorscholz Switch, a 2-mile-deep belt of fortifications that blocked the gateway to the Rhine. To the bureaucrats at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris, the Oorscholz Switch was a mathematical impossibility that would swallow any army attempting a direct assault. While Eisenhower and his planners counseled for a broad front approach and methodical logistics, Patton recognized that a defensive line is only as strong as the morale of the men inside the bunkers. He sensed that the German Wehrmacht was beginning to fracture internally, and that speed was the only currency that truly mattered in modern warfare. Patton turned to his most aggressive corps commander, General Walton Walker, whom he affectionately called his bulldog, and gave the order to punch a hole through the switch. Walker was a man of visceral intensity who never asked if a mission was possible, but only when it would begin. The tactical challenge was exacerbated by a winter of historic brutality that turned the European landscape into a freezing soup of mud and slush. For the soldiers of the 10th Armored Tiger Division and the 94th Infantry Pilgrim Division, the struggle was defined by the 3 F's of combat: fatigue, frustration, and fear. Fatigue arrived from the constant harassment and interdiction fire that rained down every 30 minutes to disrupt rest and threaten supply trucks. Frustration was born from the environment itself as tanks sank to their axles in the mud and trucks stalled on the icy slopes. Fear was the constant shadow, deepened by the sight of comrades losing limbs to bouncing Betty mines or being vaporized by the high-velocity 88mm shells that the Germans fired with terrifying accuracy from the heights. Despite these conditions, Patton insisted on what he called armed reconnaissance, a philosophy of aggressive defense that kept the enemy constantly off balance. On February 19, 1945, the Third Army launched its sledgehammer against the Oorscholz Switch. It was a symphony of mechanized violence as American tanks roared forward to smash into the dragon's teeth, while combat engineers ran through sheets of machine gun fire to blast gaps in the concrete obstacles. The 94th Infantry Division, a unit Patton had previously scolded for its high rate of non-combat casualties, was now proving its mettle in the most grueling pillbox-to-pillbox fighting of the entire war. These men had to crawl through minefields using bayonets to probe the freezing mud, knowing a single mistake would trigger a lethal explosion. At SHAEF headquarters in Paris, the anxiety was palpable, as staff officers watched the Third Army moving only inches at a time while casualties began to mount on the maps. Eisenhower's staff feared that Patton was getting bogged down in a trap that would drain the fuel and ammunition needed for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's upcoming crossing of the Rhine in the north. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery was a source of constant friction, as Patton believed Eisenhower consistently prioritized British needs over American audacity. The planners began drafting orders to halt Patton's operation, viewing his drive toward the ancient city of Trier as a reckless gamble that defied military doctrine. The city of Trier sat at the apex of the Saar-Moselle Triangle, a vital road junction and a symbol of German history founded by the Romans 2,000 years earlier. Allied intelligence reports described Trier as a natural fortress, surrounded by steep hills and protected by the swift current of the Moselle River. The Germans had issued desperate orders for the city to be held to the last man, flooding the approaches and rigging its bridges with tons of high explosives. Intelligence experts estimated that capturing such a fortified urban center would require at least 4 full divisions and result in catastrophic casualties. To the bureaucrats in Paris, it was simple arithmetic. Patton was outnumbered and walking into a meat grinder. Patton, however, was a combat artist who understood that timing was more important than numbers. He knew that if he waited for the perfect conditions demanded by the planners, the Germans would only have more time to reinforce their positions and turn Trier into a charnel house. He drove to the front lines personally, standing in the mud to scream at his tank commanders to keep moving at all costs. He sensed the hesitation from his superiors and knew that an order to stop was likely on its way from Paris. Rather than waiting for the hammer of bureaucracy to fall on his momentum, Patton decided to present Eisenhower with a done deal. The 10th Armored Division, known for its motto, "Terrify and Destroy," was chosen to lead the final dash toward the city. These Tiger tanks were mostly M4A3E8 Shermans, the famous Easy 8s, equipped with 76mm guns that provided the mobile firepower necessary to overrun German positions before they could consolidate. Fighting alongside them were the infantrymen of the 376th Regiment, who had already cleared hundreds of pillboxes in the preceding days. The German defenders were a mix of exhausted Volksgrenadier units and fanatical Hitler Youth armed with Panzerfaust, but they were being overwhelmed by the sheer velocity of the American advance. The psychological impact of Patton's leadership on his own men was profound, making them feel like an outlaw army that could achieve the impossible. They shared his disdain for the swivel chair generals in the rear and trusted in his belief that an ounce of sweat saves a gallon of blood. As the tanks of the 10th Armored reached the hills overlooking Trier on the night of March 1st, they saw the ancient city lying in total darkness below. The primary obstacle was the Moselle River, and the success of the entire campaign now hinged on a single structure that had stood for 2 millennia. The Orscholz switch breakthrough had revealed the insanity of the environment Hitler had created to protect the Reich. Every concrete block of the Dragon's Teeth was anchored to a reinforced mat sunk meters into the ground to prevent Allied engineers from easily blasting them away. The pillboxes were often camouflaged as ordinary houses, with walls 14 feet thick that could withstand everything but a point-blank hit from the largest artillery. The fact that Patton's 2 divisions were breaching this in just a few days remains an enduring mystery to military historians who analyze the math of the campaign. As the message to halt was being typed in Paris, the Tiger tanks were already warming their engines for a surprise night attack. The German High Command, believing the terrain of the Eifel Mountains was too difficult for armor to traverse quickly, was caught completely off balance. They had prioritized the defense of the Rhine, leaving Trier to be held by a collection of remnants from 26 different divisions. Patton's insistence on keeping moving was not just a mantra, but a recognition that a retreating enemy is most vulnerable when they are denied the time to dig in. The technical mastery of the German defenses in this sector cannot be overlooked, as Organization Todt had utilized hundreds of thousands of forced laborers to ensure every road was covered by interlocking fields of fire. For the American does of the 94th Infantry, every foot of ground gain was paid for in blood and exhaustion. They had to link bridgeheads under fire and scale cliffs peppered with snipers to secure the heights overlooking the city. Their partnership with the armor of the 10th Division was the foundation upon which Patton's tactical theories were turned into reality. While the politicians and planners in Paris debated what was possible, the warriors in the mud were already getting the job done. Patton's historical perspective gave him a sense of destiny, as he viewed himself as a reincarnated warrior continuing the conquests of the Roman legions he so admired. He intended to reach the Rhine and cross it before Montgomery could even launch his meticulously planned operation in the north. Taking Trier was his Alesia, his Austerlitz, and he wasn't about to let a slow-moving bureaucracy stop him from claiming his prize. The capture of Trier was not merely a victory of geography, but a profound validation of a specific military philosophy that prioritized speed and violence of action over sterile projections. The disparity between the projected casualties and the actual losses would become a rallying cry for proponents of the speed above all school of military thought. By dawn on March 2nd, the American flag was ready to be raised over the ancient Roman gate, signaling the psychological collapse of the German defense in the Rhineland. This was the moment where the Patton method of ignoring the rulebook worked better than the cautious, methodical approach favored by the Allied High Command. The stage was now set for the final act of the drama, where the capture of a single bridge would decide the fate of the city and the legacy of its conqueror. Patton had captured the spirit of an army that refused to wait for permission to win, and he was about to deliver a reply to his superiors that would echo through history. The night of March 1st, 1945, found the 10th Armored Tiger Division perched on the obsidian hills overlooking the ancient city of Trier. Below them, the birthplace of Roman emperors lay in a heavy, ominous silence, illuminated only by the occasional flare of a German sentry. The mission was as simple as it was terrifying. Seize the city under the cover of darkness and capture a bridge across the Moselle before the Germans could vaporize it with tons of prepared explosives. Lieutenant Colonel Jack J. Richardson, a man who mirrored Patton's own combat intensity, led the charge with a mandate that prioritized audacity over survival. The primary obstacle to the seizure of Trier was the swift current of the Moselle River. If the German defenders succeeded in blowing the bridges, the American tanks would be stranded on the wrong side, and the infantry would be slaughtered trying to cross in rubber boats under the fire of hidden machine gun nests. There were 3 main bridges spanning the river, but by the time Richardson's column approached, 2 had already been reduced to rubble by the retreating Wehrmacht. This left only one chance for victory: the Römerbrücke, or Roman Bridge, a marvel of ancient engineering built by the Roman Empire in 16 BC. It had survived 2,000 years of history, including the marches of Napoleon's Grand Army, but it was now packed with Nazi dynamite. Richardson ordered his men to eschew artillery preparation to maintain the maximum element of surprise. At 0200 hours, the American engines roared to life, a mechanical growl that echoed off the steep valley walls. The tanks smashed through roadblocks on the outskirts and raced down the winding medieval streets, their steel treads sparking on the ancient cobblestones. German sentries fired magnesium flares, and suddenly the night was lit with a ghastly glow as machine gun fire erupted from the windows of half-ruined houses. The Tiger tanks did not stop to engage. They kept moving with a relentless momentum that shattered the psychological cohesion of the German defense. As the lead tank turned a corner and spotted the Roman bridge, Richardson saw German engineers frantically working to ignite the demolition fuses. He shouted the order to cut them down, and his crew opened fire with their .30 caliber machine guns, killing the demolition team before they could push the plunger. A platoon of infantry jumped from the back of the tanks and sprinted onto the bridge, their boots echoing on the ancient stones. They expected the ground to open up beneath them at any second, vaporizing them in a blast of TNT, but the explosion never came. Whether the German commander hesitated or a stray bullet had severed the wire, the bridge remained intact. The Americans reached the far side, cut the demolition wires with their bayonets, and fired a green flare, the signal that the gateway was secure. Within minutes, the heavy Shermans were rumbling across the Roman stones, their weight supported by arches that had stood since the time of Augustus. The roar of the engines signaled the total collapse of the German 7th Army's resistance in the sector. Once the tanks were inside the city proper, the Germans surrendered in droves, realizing that their natural fortress had been breached with a speed they could not counter. By dawn on March 2nd, the American flag was raised over the Porta Nigra, the massive Roman gate that now overlooked a city conquered by the fastest army in history. Later that morning, George Patton stood in his headquarters, smoking a cigar and listening to the victory reports from Trier, when an aide walked in looking visibly nervous. The aide held the piece of paper that had finally arrived from Supreme Headquarters in Paris, the order drafted the previous day while the planners were still doing their math. Patton took the paper and read the command to bypass the city because it was impossible to take without reinforcements. He began to chuckle, then erupted into a loud, booming laugh that could be heard throughout the building. The irony was perfect. The bureaucracy was so slow and his army so fast that the orders were obsolete before they were even delivered. Patton turned to his staff and remarked on how the planners thought they needed 4 divisions, then sat at his desk to compose his famous reply. He took a pencil and wrote the words that would shock the Allied High Command. Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back? He handed the paper to the radio operator with instructions to send it directly to General Eisenhower at Versailles. The telegram was a calculated act of strategic theater, a direct volley in the command war against the caution and perceived lack of trust from his superiors. Patton wanted to rub the victory in the faces of the staff officers in Paris, who had doubted his methods. When the message reached Eisenhower, it caused a massive stir among the staff. Eisenhower, a man who carried the weight of the entire Allied cause on his shoulders, reportedly couldn't help but smile when he read Patton's arrogant but undeniably brilliant words. He knew he couldn't punish a general for winning a major victory under budget and ahead of schedule. Eisenhower folded the telegram, put it in his pocket, and simply issued a new directive. Congratulations. Keep moving. This response silenced the critics and proved that the Patton method of speed and violence of action was the most effective instrument for ending the war quickly. The capture of Trier was a masterstroke that accelerated the end of the war by weeks, opening the gateway to the Rhine and allowing Patton to launch his dash into the heart of Germany. In the period following the city's fall, the Third Army wrested over 6,000 square miles of territory from the enemy and captured over 140,000 soldiers, effectively eliminating the German 7th and 1st Armies as cohesive fighting forces. For the soldiers of the Third Army, the story of the telegram became a source of intense pride, making them feel like they were part of an unstoppable historic epic that defied the rulebook. However, the human cost of the campaign remained a stark reality behind the headlines. The 10th Armored Division suffered over 4,000 battle casualties during its time in Europe, with 642 men killed in action. The 94th Infantry Division saw even heavier losses, with 1,087 men killed and nearly 5,000 wounded. These men had fought through a landscape of concrete and steel, often clearing hundreds of pillboxes in a single day of intense, close-quarters combat. The disparity between the SHAEF casualty estimate of 2,000 dead for the seizure of Trier and the actual final count of 55 remains one of the most striking testaments to the power of tactical instinct. Logistical friction also played a massive role in Patton's decision-making. By March 1945, the Allied supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the ports in France, and every gallon of fuel was a precious resource. Patton knew that if his advance stalled, his fuel allocations would be redirected to Montgomery or Devers. To ensure the Third Army remained the priority, he had to maintain a constant state of offensive action, demonstrating that he could achieve greater results with fewer resources. The capture of Trier with just 2 divisions was a logistical triumph as much as a tactical one, proving that a lean and aggressive force could overcome a numerically superior but demoralized defender. The capture of Trier yielded vast quantities of enemy supplies and equipment, but more importantly, it yielded 8,000 prisoners from 26 different enemy divisions. These men, many of them older Volksgrenadiers or young recruits, were exhausted and disillusioned, surrendering in droves once they realized their retreat had been cut off. The loss of Trier was a sign to every German soldier in the sector that the end was near. General Patton's victory at Trier remains a textbook example of leadership through aggression and the importance of frontline presence. He was a man who understood that in the chaos of war, orders are often obsolete by the time they arrive. The preservation of the Roman bridge, saved by the quick thinking of Jack Richardson and the bravery of his tankers, stands as a symbol of the thin line between victory and catastrophe. Had the bridge blown, Patton's gamble would have failed, and the history books would have remembered him as a reckless commander who led his men to slaughter. Instead, the capture of Germany's oldest city proved that the Patton method worked better than the cautious approach favored by the Allied High Command. As the Third Army continued its drive toward the Rhine, the story of the telegram echoed through the foxholes and mess halls, solidifying Patton's status as a combat artist whose brilliance was often overshadowed only by his own arrogance. The Roman bridge itself, which has stood for 2,000 years, remains a physical monument to this victory. It survived the legions of Rome, the knights of the Middle Ages, the armies of Napoleon, and the dynamite of the Third Reich, finally allowing American Shermans to pass into history. The fact that it still stands today is a testament to the speed and precision of Task Force Richardson and the outlaw army of General Patton. As the war entered its final months, the story of Trier became a legendary chapter in Patton's biography, a moment he proved that strategic assumptions were no match for the instinct of a warrior. Ultimately, Patton didn't just capture a city that day. He captured the spirit of an army that refused to wait for permission to win. The defiant seizure of the oldest city in Germany remains a masterpiece of mobile warfare, a symbol of the thin line between a catastrophic meat grinder and a brilliant victory, and a testament to the enduring power of tactical instinct over bureaucratic caution. The Give It Back telegram remains one of the greatest lines in military history, a reminder that the warrior's true authority comes not from his rank, but from his results on the battlefield. The story of Trier is a story of World War II, illustrating the eternal tension between General George Patton's audacity and General Eisenhower's responsibility. It serves as a reminder to the politicians and the planners that while they were debating what was possible, The warriors were already getting it done. If you were General Eisenhower and received Patton's sarcastic telegram after he achieved an impossible victory against your orders, would you have disciplined him for insubordination or promoted him for his brilliance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.